It was funny that he mentioned the whole like short prayer thing, because I was just listening. I mentioned I've been listening to like Ravenhill and Tozer and everyone, and Ravenhill was talking about the differences between public and private prayer. And he's like, your private prayer, that's your long drawn out stuff. And he's like, look at it like a boxer. They train like 6 hours a day, everything like that, all for a 30-minute match in public. In private, they train, they do all their stuff hours and hours a day. And when it comes to their public, just one punch, it's over. And, like they make it quick in public. And it's just kind of interesting that it came up. But we're in Genesis 40 today. All right. And so, of course, as a recap, Joseph was bought by Potiphar, was accused by his wife of sexual assault by his wife. He was thrown into jail. Again, we kind of touched on the facts that, or the idea that Potiphar may not have fully believed that he was guilty, because otherwise, why would Joseph still be alive? But now we're up to. Oh yeah, you weren't here. We also mentioned that Potiphar, when it says officer, the Hebrew was the word eunuch, and so there was a chance that Potiphar was a eunuch, and she was just kind of a trophy wife that was given to him by Pharaoh, which could kind of explain why she was that way, but she was someone's wife. So it doesn't excuse the action, it just gives insight. Anyway, so we're starting in Genesis chapter 40. It came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in the custody of the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, so they were in custody for a while. All right, so we're not told exactly what they did. We're not told exactly what they did to offend Pharaoh. Some people say that there may have been a threat against his life, and so you get the two people that are in charge of the food, the head baker and the guy that actually holds the cup for Pharaoh. That's purely speculation. There's absolutely nothing said about it in Scripture. But it says that they're put in the house, or in the custody, in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison. And so it seems that this prison is kind of divided, where you have kind of a temporary housing area to find out, whether they're actually going to be sentenced into the prison proper, if they're going to be executed, kind of a place to await trial. And then something that kind of stood out to me again is it mentions, the captain of the guard, and I'm not sure if this is the full-on captain of the guard, because as we read in the last chapter, in 39, it says, Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard. So there's a chance that he's still operating in some aspect under Potiphar. Or it could just mean the captain over this one prison. But I found that kind of interesting. But Joseph, of course, is in charge of everything that's going around in here. He's very much a trustee. He's, entrusted with everything that goes on in the prison. So starting again in verse 5. Then the butler and baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came into them in the morning and looked and saw that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of the Lord's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" And they said to him, "We each had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it." So Joseph said to them, Do not all interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please. All right, so here we have something that's going on. Dreams in the ancient world were very commonly thought to be visions from God, especially when you have two dreams going on, very similar patterns, very similar patterns within the dreams. Both of them the same night, it would seem from this. And, typically you would have people who would interpret dreams. It was not uncommon. I do actually believe that, God speaks through dreams, but then we also know that dreams are sometimes absolutely meaningless. There will be something significant to the dream if it's meant to have a specific interpretation. They recognize these dreams as significant. Something we actually, I think, need to be wary of these days is there are so many books who try to interpret dreams through philosophy and things like that, and that's not an interpretation from God. That's man's idea of what do these symbols within dreams mean. Personally, I kind of like Nebuchadnezzar's approach to it. You tell me the dream I had, and then you can tell me what it means. I really like that approach with it. But it's one of those things that I do believe that God still, can communicate through dreams. But it's one of those things that don't just think because you had a dream or because it had some short-lived impression that it's necessarily from God. Does it really stick with you? Is there obvious symbolism? That kind of thing. If someone else can give an interpretation, fine, but the reason I say to really be wary about things like that, especially these days, is because at what point are you simply trying to seek after omens and apply a meaning to something when there's not really a meaning to be had? So it's something to be cautious about. But continuing on in the story, the chief butler then told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "Behold, in my dream, a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded. Its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into the Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup into Pharaoh's hand." And Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. Now 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler." By the way, typically translations will just call this a cupbearer. And we actually do have a historical record of the cupbearer being a very prominent figure. I mean, they served Pharaoh directly. Their job was to stand at hand and just serve him directly. Unlike the baker who works kind of offhand and then goes. John and then Kathy. Oh, okay, Kathy.
I think too their job was to taste it before they gave it to the...
Mm-hmm. Okay, that was what you were going to say. Their job may have been to taste it too. Yeah, and that's kind of what I think kind of leans toward the idea that it was, that there may have been some plot on his life, because we find out that they get thrown in jail, they have this dream. Now, we don't know exactly how long they were in jail before they had this dream. But as soon as they get out, 3 days later, it's Pharaoh's birthday, and he's having a massive celebration. So the speculation fits. It's just not actually talked about.
I think also his proximity to Pharaoh would make him an advisor also.
Oh, that's true.
He's hearing everything that's going on right there.
That's true. And Pharaoh does take his word on it in the next chapter when he's like, "Isn't there anyone?" And he's like, "Yeah, there was a guy I met in jail." So he's not viewing him as a nothing. Come on, brain. There we go. Okay. So Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it," in verse 12. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in your hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show this kindness to me, and make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon. When the chief baker saw the interpretation was good. But before I actually move on to verse 16, like I said, it was very common at this time for an interpreter of dreams to just be kind of a position. And so you would pay someone for them to interpret your dream. It's not out of place for him to just offer, to ask for a favor. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I was also in my dream, and there were 3 baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. So Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Now, some translations, I believe, like the JPS might say it, but I know that the Eitz Chaim, instead of saying hung from a tree, it said impaled on a stake. And we know that being impaled was a common death sentence at the time.
It says impale you on a pole.
Impale?
Yes.
Okay. And so it's kind of one of those things where he is hung, but not in the way that we think of, like a rope, hanging from the neck. Yes, John.
Since they were translating to English, they wanted to make it something that they could understand. Mm-hmm. They had no idea what impaling on the pole was.
Possibly. But yeah, it is very common to just, take this, what like is kind of common at the time that translations happened. A lot of people were hung. So yeah, that was probably just brought over, hey, it's a death sentence, to kind of emphasize that. Especially since at the time, back in the day, we have a luxury of having all of this in printed text and the ability to study. And if you're talking about before printing presses and having to just read it, you want people to get off the bat, okay, death sentence. But there is a little bit of play on words here. If you notice, he said to the cupbearer, Pharaoh's going to lift your head. And then here in verse 19, what was prophesied is that literally in the Hebrew it still says to lift your head. It just says to lift your head off of you. So both of them are getting their heads lifted, one in a much more pleasant manner. So Joseph had answered, I mentioned that, so we're in verse 20. Now it came to pass that on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And so we kind of see the fulfillment of that play on words where it says he lifted up both of their heads, lifted up one in status and then executed the other. And it's interesting that it's his birthday, but he throws the feast for his servants, right? And it's kind of a prime opportunity for him to send a very strong message that he'll be very generous and he'll be very generous if you're good to him, but he's also not going to show mercy if you're guilty. It was a great opportunity there to draw a contrast that I'm willing to be gracious and forgive, and I'm also willing to punish. And I think that really may have been one of the reasons for the feasts, was to try to get that across, because it says that the feast was for his servants. But that's really all there is. It was a very short, direct one. A little bit of talking about dreams. And that's pretty much it. Very direct.